so much. I know that we're getting ready to close, but there may be someone in the audience that might have a question of Dr. Bredesen. Would you like to come up and ask your question?
So that's Senator Liu's Chief of Staff. Suzanne.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Suzanne Reed. I'm Chief of Staff for Senator Carol Liu, Chair of the Select Committee on Aging and Long-Term Care in the Senate. Just digging back into my own history, I don't remember Alzheimer's as like in our neighborhood or the older folks. I mean, we would talk about people losing their, dementia or grandpa, doesn't remember this or that. But has there been an increase in the incidence of the disease over the generations, and are those attributed to environmental factors? It's kind of a two-part question. Can you just also, when you talk about the treatment or the regimen, what it entails? Is it holistic plus medicine? And those are my two questions.
So you bring up some very good points. First of all, about the incidents, and you're right that when I was a little boy, it's the same thing. That there would be a few people where they weren't quite right, but you didn't talk about it very much. And of course, with research, it became clear what was going on with such people. And just as an example, I talked to a physician just the other day who was from another state on the East Coast, who said that he was following a person. Well, this person had all the tests. It was already known she had Alzheimer's. She fulfilled all the criteria. And he said to me, she just seems to me to be a little different, a little crazy. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. She's already had all that. We know exactly what's going on. So people don't sometimes realize that this is a disease. It's something we can look at imaging-wise and biomarkers and all those sorts of things. But as you well know, we're seeing increases in obesity. We're seeing increases in type 2 diabetes. And, of course, we're seeing increases in poor nutrition. All of these things are associated with increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. So if you have a very low vitamin D, for example, you are at increased risk for Alzheimer's. And one of the things that's amazing is that these things that don't seem to be related, if you didn't go very far in school, you have an increased risk. If you had some head trauma, you're at increased risk. If you had an early hysterectomy without HRT, without being treated hormonally, you're at increased risk. These things don't sound like they have anything to do with each other, but in fact, they're all part of that symphony. They're all part. You're taking out different parts of the orchestra, and then at the end, you're finding that it's not playing correctly. So what do you do about it? So what we're saying is, look, if we now understand all the pieces, this network, so we don't think of this anymore as a unidimensional disease. We think of this as a network imbalance, just as we were talking about with osteoporosis and with these other things. So, of course, what we want to do is everything possible to rebalance that network. So it does include looking at your nutrition. It does include not only what you eat, when you eat. It turns out that your brain is actually cleaned while you're sleeping. So you should not be eating for 12 hours between your finishing your dinner and you're starting your breakfast. It allows you time to induce a process that's called autophagy. It tells you you shouldn't be eating for 3 hours typically before you go to bed. How often you exercise, what your stress level is, how much you sleep. The first woman that I showed you there had a very stressful job where she was sleeping 4.5 to 5 hours a night. She's now sleeping 7.5 hours a night. So that's part of the overall program. Then there is a whole list of things. You want to know not just to be in the normal range, but to be in the optimal range. So how many people here know their HSCRP? Okay. How many people here know their iodine levels? Okay. And okay, one person knows. Okay. So these are things that we will be evaluating. We will have better and better biomarkers. These are things that we should know going forward, just as we want to know our cholesterol. So most people know what their HDL and LDL is or what their total cholesterol is. That's the way this is headed, the same idea. But it's many different things that all contribute. So when we treat it, we look at what your B12 level is. We look at what your folate is. We look at what your homocysteine is, and on and on and on. And we don't just bring them to the low end of normal. We want to optimize them to get you, because we already know one thing. When you come in, you're on the wrong side of that balance. So we want to pull out all the stops to bring you back to the right side of the balance.
Thank you.
Yes, you want to come up?
Do you have collaborators here in the Sacramento area?
We do not currently have collaborators in the Sacramento area, but as you know, UC Davis is one of the CADCs and is a major, in fact, is currently the leader is there. So they've done an outstanding job in Sacramento. We are not currently, as is at UC Davis, of course, but we don't currently have collaborators there. However, we are working with a group that is trying to make this available as widely as possible, essentially a software engineering group that will make this available to everybody.
So the items that you need to look for, is that why a software engineer is involved? Or?
Because the algorithm is very complicated. So, for example, that first woman, of course, when she came in, we didn't know. We only knew what the model was. We didn't know this was going to work. So we spent about 2.5 hours going through all the things and trying to say, here's why we're asking you to do all this crazy stuff, and went through everything. And then, of course, dozens and dozens of emails following up. So it's not easy initially to find out what's the cause. And so we're not asking just what is it? Is it Alzheimer's? We're asking why is it? Why did you get this? Why are you on the wrong side of this balance? What are all the contributors to all the pieces that are making a contribution? Often small contributions from many different things, but you add them up, you now put you on the wrong side. And again, just like osteoporosis or cardiovascular disease. So what the software engineering allows us to do is take a very complicated situation. For example, just the genetic part, you have 3.3 billion base pairs. The doctor, you got to look a long way to read all those. So what happens, the program will allow you to have everything together, all the metabolomics, the genetics, et cetera, to say, okay, here are the things that are actually contributing, and here are the things that we want to change, and here's what to do about it. And then, of course, offering you all sorts, well, if this doesn't work, you go here, you call this. Part of this is behavioral therapy that you want to understand. As you can imagine, the hardest thing about this has been we're trying to change people's behaviors that are leading to their cognitive problems. Many of the people I see do indeed have pre-diabetes, pre-type 2 diabetes, very common. And of course, that's a strong association with Alzheimer's disease.
Have you had anyone involved who has Parkinson's?
So we have now just started. We call this MEND, so that we've just developed what's called MEND PD, MEND for Parkinson's, but we haven't even treated one person yet.
I have a volunteer for you, and we'll drive to L.A. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Doctor. This is excellent. I have two questions, and again, I'm with AARP, Blanca Castro. The first question is, why is this not more publicized, and what can we do? We represent 3.2 million members in California, so what can we as an organization do to publicize this information? And then secondly, what is the cost for the person, and you mentioned there were some people, to even access these drugs?
Yeah, thank you. So, of course, as I mentioned with Margaret Mead, when I said a small group, and of course I'm including AARP, the Alzheimer's Association. They will be the leaders, going forward for all of these neurodegenerative conditions, and especially Alzheimer's disease. This is the beginning, and you have to remember. And I think that, just as you have checks and balances with the justice and the legislative system and the executive branch, we have checks and balances in medical research. What we published was the first 10 anecdotes. These are anecdotes. These are 10 people who came in. This has literally just come out of 25 years of work in the test tube. So this is early. There's not a reason to accept it until we do a bigger trial. So that's the next step, is to do a larger trial. Now, let me mention that we tried to do this trial in 2011 in Australia. And the reason was because we had a drug to include in addition to all these things that was available in Australia but not in the U.S. So we submitted this entire protocol to both the public and the private IRB in Australia. And they denied, they would not allow us to do this trial. They said it's too complicated. And they said, this is not the way you do a drug trial. You just have to have one drug or nothing. And we said, yeah, but that's not the way the disease works. So my hope is that we will convince over time the IRBs. And by the way, so we are testing the drug alone in Australia. But I don't have great hope that that's going to be anything really great. It's definitely better than the drugs that are available. We tested it against those. But it's not a real major step forward in Alzheimer's disease. So we want to make it so that you're able to take a program that is as complicated as the disease is,
right,
where you can now add your drug. So we did, by the way, this was on CNN.com, our paper. It was in television both in the Bay Area and in LA. But it didn't get more support because it shouldn't yet, because it was an anecdotal report of 10 people.
Okay.
Now, your other part, how much does it cost and access? Again, the costs are changing rapidly. As we get the software out there, it will be very inexpensive. But at the beginning, again, this is not standard of care yet. This is
Right.
coming out of the test tube.
So it's an expensive product right now.
Well,
For the 10 people.
Not terribly. So they had different imaging things that, in fact, imaging is often paid for by Medicare. For example, MRIs
Right.
typically paid for. And in many cases, PET scans will be paid for. FDG PET scans will be paid for by Medicare. Many of the blood tests are paid for. But as you might imagine, some of the blood tests are not paid for yet. We'd love to see people say, hey, these are important blood tests. This does tell you, just like cholesterol might have been seen 50 years ago, hey, these are important blood tests. We should all know them. So right now what costs is the blood tests, and then there's a panoply of things that you're taking, and then some of the supplements cost something significant. But it's not a huge amount. And I have to say, compared to what it costs to be in a nursing home, it's extremely, extremely minimal.
Understood. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Alan Bortel from the California Senior Legislature. Thank you so much, Dr. Bredesen, for appearing here today. A lot of things we do we use anecdotal evidence, such as we're told dental hygiene is brought about by brushing your teeth twice a day, but some people who brush once a day are just as good off, just as well off, and those who use a rubber tip are better off. All these are anecdotal, and so you've used that term to describe the 36 protocols, and I think there's enough in those which are, none of them are life-threatening or unhealthy, because every one of them sounds like it's healthy. Certainly everybody can stop eating for 12 hours while they, from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., shall we say, and don't eat before going to bed. And talking with one of your associates, that this helps the brain cells calm down, maybe reduces inflammation, if that's the right term, and that's our goal, is to, as you say, boost the resistance and make your brain stronger. And we know enough of these things that can't they be packaged anecdotally? The National Institute of Health has a few of them. They're saying, well, lowering stress is good, maybe. Yoga might be good, maybe. And several, Mediterranean diet. We all have heard for years that's the way to eat, Mediterranean diet. And that, and wild fish, not farmed fish. These are various protocols in your 36. So what I'm wondering is, how do we pull all this together? I had proposed that the legislature give the Mental Health Services Act a little tapping it to broadcast these techniques or these protocols or these methods more broadly. But I wonder, are we at the point where they should be broadcast loudly and clearly by the state?
That's a very good question. Obviously, that's up to the state. But I should mention that we've now seen 35, so we published the first 10, but we're seeing the same sort of thing again and again. Again, we still need a larger trial. When we went before the IRB in Australia, one of the things that they said was, yes, all these things are already known to be generally regarded as safe, GRAS as they call it. But we're not sure that when you combine a bunch of safe things, it might not be dangerous. So I said, well, what do you think taking a multivitamin is? These are the kinds of concerns, and they're understandable. It's something new and different. But I agree with you. I think that we have an opportunity here to get these things out, and you're right. Many of these things are things that are, in fact, very good for your brain. And what that tells us on the flip side is that many of us, with the lifestyles we're leading, with the things that we're doing, with the way we're eating and stressing and not sleeping and all the things we're contributing to our own future of Alzheimer's. And we already see that. But as you pointed out, people keep asking for single things. Well, does doing yoga help? Well, it does seem to help a little bit. But again, it's like saying, well, do the violins sound like a symphony? Well, a little bit. Do the French horns, is that it? Is that the right one? Is it the timpani? You've got to get these things together, and we need to think going forward about a much more multivariable analysis in our clinical trials and in our thoughts about how we're going to handle this in a public health manner.
I have one last question, and we'll be closing. And my husband has been diagnosed with ALS. But he was diagnosed with ALS in 2002. And he does things that doctors say he shouldn't do, like pull up and exercise. They told him you can't exercise because it'll burn out your muscles. His muscles are gone anyway. Right. So he does it anyway. And he went to the doctor about, I guess it was 3 months ago. The doctor said, "What are you doing?" He said, your upper body strength is so much better than it used to be. And so he said, "I'm doing that exercise that you told me not to do." Yeah. But I was just wondering, have you started any work on people with that particular disease?
We have not, but interestingly, several months ago, someone who saw this sent me a website, and I read it, and it said Healin' Gals. And I said, Healin' Gals, this must be ladies who heal. But it turned out to be Healing ALS. So I had read it wrong to begin with. So it turns out that Healing ALS, if you look at that website, they've got some wonderful results. And as you already know, your husband is an amazing person because he's already far outlived the vast majority of people who were diagnosed in 2002. So whether it's because of you or because of something else he's doing something right.
He does eat, fresh vegetables. He does a lot of that, and he doesn't have any stress.
Good to hear it. So,
he doesn't.
This is the sort of thing that's being shown again and again with Healing ALS on this website. So we are at as I said, we're at the dawn of an era of neurodegenerative disease improvement. And this is the way we have to think going forward, not that these things are impossible.
Well, I am so impressed, I don't know what to do. Thank you so much for being here. This meeting is adjourned.